Secrets hide in every shadow.
It was a bright, wind-ruffled afternoon in the village of St. Gildas, the sort of day that set the wild roses trembling along the stone walls and turned the waters of the bay a glittering silver. At the edge of the little harbour, the newly restored lighthouse gleamed like a porcelain chess piece against the blue. The villagers had spoken of little else for weeks. The lamp had been electrified at last, and Mr. Jonas Black, the long-time keeper, was to demonstrate its first official lighting that evening. The event had been turned, as was everything in St. Gildas, into an occasion. Mrs. Penworthy, stout and excitable, had organized a tea stall near the quay. The Reverend Miles, who fancied himself a man of progressive ideas, had insisted on an opening prayer that mentioned coastal safety in the modern age. Even the usually reticent fisherman, Sam Tripp, promised to scrub the salt from his boots and attend. Miss Marple, visiting her old school friend Mrs. Caroline Linton, found herself persuaded to join the celebration. She rather liked St. Gildas, with its narrow lanes and the smell of seaweed that lingered about the cottages. Seated on a bench by the harbour, knitting a pale blue shawl, she watched the scene with mild amusement. To her keen eye, the gathering offered more than civic pride. It presented a small parade of human nature, each person's true self peeking out from beneath their Sunday best. Jonas Black himself stood apart, a tall, weather-worn man in a dark jacket. His lined face held the stern patience of one who had weathered both storms and solitude. He spoke little, but there was a quiet authority about the way he kept one hand on the brass telescope slung across his shoulder. More than once Miss Marple noticed the way villagers deferred to him with a nod, as though his years among the rocks and tides had lent him a touch of myth. Yet not all the attention was admiring. Mr. Oliver Hardwick, the wealthy Londoner who had purchased the old Coast Guard cottage, regarded the keeper with thinly veiled dislike. Miss Marple, who had a gift for small, seemingly idle questions, had already learned that Hardwick objected to the lighthouse's beam shining across his bedroom curtains. Quite intolerable, he had declared the evening before at supper with the Lintons. Some provincial relic clinging to authority. He'll blind half the village before long. The festivities progressed with the gentle chaos of any English gathering. A dog snatched a scone from a distracted child. Mrs. Penworthy scolded a pair of boys for clambering onto the jetty rails. The wind lifted the Reverend's hat and sent it tumbling into the shallows, where Sam Tripp fished it out with a net, muttering about landlubbers meddling with the sea. As dusk lowered its violet veil over the bay, the crowd gathered nearer the base of the lighthouse. Mr. Black ascended the spiral stairs, steady as a gull on the breeze. A hush fell as the lamp flickered, flared, and cast a clean white beam across the darkening water. The villagers broke into applause. Even Mr. Hardwick offered a perfunctory clap. Then came the sound, unexpected, jarring. A hollow clang from somewhere within the tower, followed by a muffled shout. People exchanged puzzled glances. Seconds later, the keeper reappeared at the rail of the lantern room, leaning out into the wind. His expression was one of bewilderment, perhaps pain. He seemed to speak, though the words were lost to the gust. He staggered, clutched at the railing and pitched forward into the void. A collective cry rose from below. Someone screamed. The others dashed toward the rocks where Mr. Black's body lay motionless, half hidden by sea thrift. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with calm precision and rose to her feet. Her thin figure was unremarkable amid the commotion, yet her eyes were very bright. "Fetch Dr. Hargood," Mrs. Linton gasped, gripping Miss Marple's arm. "Oh, Jonas, poor Jonas. Do you suppose he slipped?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. She had already noted, with the clarity that years of village observation bring, the unnatural angle of the man's fall and the odd gleam along the railing where he had grasped for support. Something in the moment, the abrupt clang, the hesitation before he fell, did not fit the tidy picture of an accident. By the time Dr. Hargood knelt beside the body, night was thickening. His verdict, delivered in the glow of a hurricane lamp, was blunt. Neck broken. Died at once. He glanced up, frowning at the lighthouse looming above. Strange. He must have lost his footing, but, well, we'll need to notify the constable. The constable, young Mr. Pettigrew, arrived puffing from the direction of the village green. He examined the body, scratched his head, and announced that it would, of course, require a formal report. Though if you ask me, he added, lowering his voice. Mr. Black had been keeping himself to himself of late. Folks said he'd been nervous, locking the lantern room in the daytime. Perhaps he was unwell. While the official voices debated, Miss Marple wandered a few paces from the crowd. She peered up at the lighthouse, where the lamp turned its steady circle, casting rhythmic slices of light across the harbour. Her mind, tidy as a well-kept sitting room, began placing the evening's details into quiet order. The clang, the fall, the tension between Black and Hardwick, the faint tremor she'd noticed in Mrs. Penworthy's hands when the keeper ascended the stairs. A faint sound drew her attention, a scrape of boot on stone. She turned to see Sam Tripp slipping something into the pocket of his oilskin before hurrying back to the others. He looked up and caught her gaze, then offered a quick, almost guilty nod. Miss Marple inclined her head politely, as if she had seen nothing at all. Soon the body was borne away to the vicarage outbuilding, there being no mortuary in St. Gildas. The villagers departed in subdued clusters, voices low against the restless sea. Mrs. Linton clung to Miss Marple's arm as they ascended the slope toward the cottage. "Such a dreadful accident," Caroline murmured. "Poor Jonas." "He was so steady." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "A steady man indeed. And yet, my dear Caroline, I think perhaps he did not fall entirely of his own accord." Her companion looked startled. "You mean you think it might have been—" Miss Marple gave her a serene smile, though her eyes were sharp as the moonlit water below. "Let us not rush to conclusions. Still, I fancy the tide will wash up more than seaweed before this business is over." Behind them, the lighthouse beam swept once more across the bay, pale and searching, as if unwilling to let the night hide its secret. Morning came to St. Gildas with a pale mist lying low over the harbour, softening the outlines of boats and rooftops alike. The lighthouse stood sentinel on its rocky point, its white walls gleaming through the haze, as though nothing untoward had happened there the night before. Yet a hush clung to the village. Shutters opened more slowly, and voices were pitched lower than usual, as if the sea breeze itself might be listening. At the Linton cottage, Miss Marple poured tea with the same unhurried grace she brought to everything. Caroline Linton, however, was far from composed. She fussed over the toast, scattering crumbs across the table. "I hardly slept," she confessed. "I kept seeing poor Jonas lying there. And the way his arm was bent, it was dreadful. I can't believe it was only last evening we were laughing about Mrs. Penworthy's scones." Miss Marple stirred her cup thoughtfully. "Her sudden tragedy often leaves the hours before it curiously bright in memory," she said. "I remember once in St. Mary Mead a gardener fell from a ladder, quite harmless in the end, but I can still picture the way the sun was shining on the roses that morning." Caroline dabbed her eyes. "You don't suppose—" "You hinted last night that perhaps it wasn't an accident." "My dear Caroline," Miss Marple replied, "one ought to be very slow to form conclusions. Yet there were aspects that struck me as, shall we say, uncharacteristic of a mere slip." She did not elaborate, and Caroline, who had long ago learned that her friend rarely spoke without reason, let the matter drop. Outside, the lane was alive with speculation. Mrs. Penworthy stood at her gate recounting the events to anyone who would listen, embroidering the tale with each telling. "I was nearest the tower, you know," she announced to Mrs. Tripp, who had come down from the hill farm with a basket of eggs. "If he'd fallen naturally, he'd have struck the stones differently. I dare say the doctor will find something peculiar when he examines him." Mrs. Tripp, a neat woman with sharp eyes, shook her head. Jonas was a steady man. He didn't drink, and he knew those stairs better than anyone. There's talk he'd had trouble with Mr. Hardwick, the gentleman from London. Light shining into his rooms, keeping him awake. Hardwick was there, put in young Lily Prout, the postmistress, who had sidled up with her delivery bag. "I saw him standing back when Jonas fell, his face all white and set. Mark my words, he'll be glad if someone else keeps the light now." Sam Tripp arrived at that moment, his oilskin still damp from the tide. He nodded curtly to the women and made for the harbour without lingering. Miss Marple, passing by on her morning walk, observed the exchange with polite interest. Sam's avoidance of the gossip seemed almost too deliberate. She noted as well the bulge in his pocket, the same one she had seen the night before. By mid-morning, Constable Pettigrew was making his rounds, armed with a notebook and an air of solemn importance. He questioned Mrs. Penworthy, jotted something, then looked doubtful when she tried to demonstrate the precise angle of Jonas Black's descent using her broom handle. "Best leave the particulars to the doctor, madam," he said kindly. "I'm to take statements and see if anyone heard anything odd." Miss Marple, seated on a bench overlooking the quay, listened to Pettigrew's conversations with apparent abstraction, her knitting needles flashing in and out of soft grey wool. From time to time she looked up, her blue eyes clear beneath the brim of her hat. Dr. Hargood emerged from the vicarage outbuilding near noon, his brow furrowed. He conferred with Pettigrew out of earshot, but their expressions were sober. A moment later the constable came over to where Miss Marple sat. "Good morning, miss," he said, clearing his throat. "Doctor's done what he can. Says the injuries are consistent with a fall, but he's not satisfied about the cause. There's a bruise on the back of the head, not from the rocks, he thinks, but from something round and heavy. We'll have to wait for the inspector from Helston." "How very distressing," Miss Marple murmured. "One so hopes for the sake of everyone that it may be explained without unpleasantness. Though I fear the world seldom arranges itself for our comfort." Pettigrew, unused to such remarks, gave her a puzzled look before resuming his duties. After luncheon, Caroline persuaded Miss Marple to accompany her to the harbour, ostensibly to see whether Mrs. Penworthy required help with the tea stall, which she had insisted on reopening despite the tragedy. In truth, both women wished to gauge the temper of the village. A small knot of people stood near the lighthouse path. Mr. Hardwick, immaculately dressed despite the sea breeze. Lily Prout, and Sam Tripp, leaning against the low wall with his arms folded. Hardwick was speaking sharply. I told the man repeatedly that the light was intolerable. "Perhaps he was distracted, but that hardly obliges me to blame myself," Lily bristled. "No one's blaming you, sir, but there's no call to speak ill of the dead." Sam muttered something indistinct and turned away, staring out at the tide. Miss Marple, who had paused within earshot, caught a flicker of unease cross his weathered face. Presently the group dispersed. Miss Marple approached the lighthouse itself, its door now secured with a constable's seal. She studied the stone threshold, the iron handrail, the narrow spiral of steps visible through the glass. She thought of the hollow clang they had heard just before Jonas appeared, unsteady at the lantern room rail. Something metal, perhaps, striking against the inside wall. She bent to examine a faint smear near the base of the railing. Salt, and beneath it a trace of rust-coloured dust. Caroline called softly from the path, and Miss Marple straightened, brushing her gloved hands. "Merely admiring the workmanship," she said, with her usual mildness. As they made their way back toward the village, they encountered Reverend Miles striding from the rectory, his cassock flapping in the breeze. "Terrible business, ladies," he said, shaking his head. "I spent the morning drafting a prayer for poor Black's soul. And yet, well, the Lord teaches us to forgive, but I cannot like the notion that someone here may be capable of violence." Miss Marple gave him a gentle look. "One hopes it is not so, Reverend. Yet human nature, alas, is often less tidy than Scripture." That afternoon the mist thickened, bringing with it a chill from the sea. People stayed close to their hearths, but windows twitched as neighbours kept watch on one another. Children were called indoors earlier than usual, for even the gulls seemed subdued, huddling on the quay. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire in Caroline's parlour, her knitting set aside in favour of thought. She reviewed each face from the night before. Mr. Hardwick's irritation, Mrs. Penworthy's tremor, Sam Tripp's stealthy gesture, Lily's quick concern, the Reverend's solemnity. The village, like any village, was a tapestry of small grievances and unspoken histories. Somewhere in those threads lay the reason Jonas Black had fallen to his death. When dusk crept in, Pettigrew returned with news. Inspector Mallerie was on his way by motorcar and expected before dark. "He'll want to talk to everyone who was present," the constable said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Best keep yourselves handy." After he left, Caroline poured sherry for them both. "Do you think the inspector will find anything, Jane?" she asked, reverting to the name of their youth. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her eyes remained fixed on the fire. "That depends, my dear, on how clearly he sees what lies before him. Men, in my experience, often look for footprints and fingerprints when they might do better to study expressions." She sipped her sherry, then set the glass carefully on the side table. Outside, the beam from the lighthouse turned in its slow arc, cutting through the fog like the sweep of a patient eye. To Miss Marple it seemed almost expectant. as though the lonely tower knew there was more to reveal before the truth of the keeper's end could come to light. Inspector Mallerie arrived in St. Gilda's just as the last light of day sank behind the headland, his motorcar rattling over the cobbles of the harbour road. A tall, spare man with hair prematurely grey at the temples, he exuded the calm briskness of one used to sorting order from confusion. Constable Pettigrew, eager to assist, met him at the quay and led him toward the Linton cottage, where several villagers had been asked to gather. Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair near the hearth, her knitting once again in hand. She watched with interest as Mallerie surveyed the small parlour, taking note of the faces. Mr. Hardwick, stiff-backed in a chair by the window, Mrs. Penworthy, clutching a handkerchief and dabbing at her eyes, Sam Tripp, who stood in the shadowed corner, cap in hand, and Lily Prout, who perched nervously on the edge of a footstool. Caroline Linton poured tea for all, a fragile attempt to restore some domestic calm. "Right," said Mallerie, removing his gloves. "Doctor tells me there's reason to suspect Mr. Black's fall may not have been simple mischance. I'd like each of you to recount what you saw and heard. We'll keep it civil." He began with Hardwick, who cleared his throat and launched into an account, marked by a faint air of self-justification. "I was standing with Miss Prout a few paces from the tower. I heard a clanging noise, rather like a loose shutter striking metal. Then Black appeared at the top rail, looked dazed, almost ill, and over he went. Shocking business. I can't imagine why the man insisted on climbing so high in the dark." Lily coloured slightly. "He didn't seem ill to me, sir. He waved just before he fell, almost as though someone had startled him." Mallory's brows drew together. "Startled by what?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but it wasn't only the clang. I thought I saw something move inside the lantern room, a shadow behind him." The inspector made a note. He turned to Mrs. Penworthy, who, between fits of sighing, claimed she had been too intent on arranging her cakes to see much. "Though I did hear Mr. Hardwick say something sharp to Jonas earlier," she added, with the relish of one passing along useful information. Hardwick flushed. "I merely reminded him about the beam shining into my rooms." A civil remark, hardly cause for melodrama. Mallerie said nothing, but Miss Marple noticed the slight downturn of his lips as he jotted another line. Sam Tripp's account was brief. "Wasn't near enough to see proper," he muttered. "Busy with the boats." His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and his gaze slid away from the inspector's steady eyes. Mallerie dismissed them one by one, keeping Miss Marple for last. "You were present too, madam," he said. "Did anything strike you?" "Oh, merely little things," she replied, her tone light. "The order in which people stood, the expressions on their faces when the lamp was lit, and Mr. Black's hesitation before he fell. It suggested surprise rather than vertigo, if one may be permitted a layperson's observation." Mallerie regarded her with curiosity. "You've a sharp eye." Miss Marple smiled, modest but unflustered. "One sees a good deal if one spends years among small doings in small places." When the interviews ended, the inspector and Pettigrew left for the vicarage to view the body again. The others dispersed into the night, their voices subdued. Miss Marple accompanied Caroline back into the sitting room, where the fire burned low. "What do you make of him?" Caroline asked once they were alone. "He appears thorough," Miss Marple said, winding a length of yarn. "Yet thoroughness is not always the same as understanding. I fancy Mr. Mallerie will look for footprints and fingerprints, but the truth here may lie in something far more delicate." Meanwhile, Mallory's own investigations led him to the lighthouse. He paced the narrow stairwell by lamplight, noting the scuffed tread where Black's boots had passed. Halfway up, he found a faint smear along the wall, a dull reddish mark. He crouched, touched it, and sniffed. Rust, perhaps, or old paint. Near the lantern room, he examined the railing where Black had grasped before falling. A faint dent marred the brass, as though something heavy had struck it. Outside, the wind sighed over the rocks. Mallerie turned, scanning the room. A heavy wrench lay on a shelf beside the service logbook. He picked it up, testing its weight, then replaced it with care. The log itself recorded nothing unusual, only notes about the evening tide and a remark, written in Black's firm hand, that the lamp had been checked and polished. The inspector stood for a long time at the window, staring down at the rocks where the keeper had landed. There were no footprints, only jagged stone and tufts of sea thrift. But Mallerie had a sense, faint, elusive, that the answer was hidden not in the stones but in the relationships knotted around this quiet village. Back at the Linton cottage, Miss Marple was engaged in gentle conversation with Sam Tripp, who had returned under pretext of delivering fresh mackerel. She thanked him warmly, then, as he hesitated on the threshold, remarked in an offhand way, "I do hope you didn't take cold last night, standing by the water so late." Sam blinked, startled. I'm used to the chill, ma'am." "Yes, of course. Fishermen often are." She gave him a kindly smile, though her eyes lingered on the pocket where something hard pressed against the oilskin. "And it must be trying, keeping one's footing when the rocks are slick. One could so easily drop a tool or what have you." He flushed, mumbled a good night, and left hurriedly. Caroline emerged from the kitchen, frowning. "You do rattle people, Jane. What do you suppose he's hiding?" "Not hiding, dear, protecting. There is a difference." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Later that evening, Mallerie returned to share his findings. "There's more here than meets the eye," he told Caroline and Miss Marple as they sat before the fire. "The bruise on Black's head isn't from his fall. And that dent on the railing looks like a blow from something solid. Whoever did this may have been up there with him." Caroline gasped. "Then one of the villagers must have gone inside the tower." "So that's the question," Mallerie said grimly. The door was unlocked for the ceremony. Anyone could have slipped in after him. Miss Marple studied the inspector with mild interest. "A most perplexing situation indeed. I wonder, though, whether you have considered why Mr. Black seemed uneasy in recent weeks." Mallerie looked surprised. "You knew about that?" "Only what one hears," she said gently. "He had grown secretive, I understand, locking the lantern room as if guarding something. That suggests either he had found something worth hiding, or he feared an intrusion." The inspector gave a slow nod. "If you learn anything, Mrs. Marple, I'd appreciate being told." She inclined her head. "Naturally." After he left, Caroline fussed with the curtains, clearly agitated. "Do you think the murderer is still among us, Jane?" "My dear, I should be very much astonished if he or she were not." The night settled over St. Gilda's, heavy with mist and secrets. From the point, the lighthouse cast its patient beam across the bay, slicing the darkness at steady intervals. In one cottage window after another, lamplight flickered out as villagers sought uneasy sleep. But in the Linton parlour, Miss Marple sat awake, her needles resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the faint gleam of the tower. Somewhere behind its calm facade, she felt, lay a motive as old as human frailty: envy, greed, resentment, or perhaps fear. She thought of Jonas Black's solitary life, the pride he took in his post, the little friction with Hardwick, the fisherman's grudges about harbour dues, even Mrs. Penworthy's nervous glances. The pattern was not yet clear, but the outlines were beginning to take shape like a tapestry glimpsed through mist. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing from long experience that patience would draw the threads tighter until the whole was revealed. When at last she retired, the sea outside was murmuring against the rocks, and the beam from the lighthouse swept through her window like the measured beat of a heart, steady and inexorable, counting down to the moment when the truth would stand exposed. The following morning dawned with a brittle clearness after the fog, the sky swept clean by an easterly breeze. St. Gilda's stirred cautiously back to life, shutters clapped open, smoke coiled from chimneys, and fishermen prepared their nets along the quay. Yet beneath this semblance of normality ran a taut undercurrent. Conversations broke off when strangers approached, and every footstep on the cobbles seemed to echo with questions unspoken. Inspector Mallerie, brisk and unsmiling, established himself at the small reading room attached to the parish hall. There he spread his notes, arranging them with military precision, while Constable Pettigrew ferried in the villagers one by one for further statements. Miss Marple, sitting with Caroline Linton on a bench outside, knitted serenely as she listened to the faint rise and fall of voices from within. The first to emerge was Lily Prout. She clutched her bag against her side, her cheeks pink from nervousness. "He asked all about where I was standing," she whispered to Caroline, "and if I'd noticed anyone near the steps of the tower." Her eyes darted anxiously toward the harbour. "I told him the truth, of course, but he made me feel as if I'd done something wrong." Hardwick was next. He strode out stiffly, adjusting his tie, and walked away without a word, though the set of his jaw suggested the interview had not been pleasant. Mrs. Penworthy came after, dabbing theatrically at her eyes with a fresh handkerchief. "I only said what I saw," she announced to the air at large. But one can hardly be blamed if gentlemen choose to twist one's remarks. Sam Tripp lingered inside longer than the others. When at last he emerged, he kept his gaze firmly fixed on the cobbles and departed without greeting anyone. Miss Marple's eyes followed him thoughtfully, noting again the habitual way he pressed a hand against the left pocket of his coat, as though guarding some hidden object. Inside the hall, Mallerie rubbed his forehead. "A dozen stories," he muttered to Pettigrew. "Not one of them quite fits." He turned to the constable. "Fetch the logbooks from the harbour office. I want to know if Black recorded any unusual visitors or incidents." By late morning, the inspector decided to examine the tower again, this time in daylight. Miss Marple, passing nearby with Caroline, paused at the base of the stairs. Mallerie glanced down from where he stood on the first step. "Mrs. Marple," he said, "since you're here, I'd value a second pair of eyes." She accepted the invitation with quiet composure. Together they climbed the narrow spiral, Pettigrew following behind. The brass rail caught the sunlight, gleaming softly except where the dent marred its curve. Mallerie pointed to it. "There. Doctor thinks Black was struck before he toppled over. Blow to the head, then a shove." Miss Marple traced the mark with a gloved finger. "How curious," she murmured. "One would imagine a person determined on violence might seek to be entirely rid of their victim. Yet whoever acted here seems to have been surprised, or hurried." They moved into the lantern room, where the great lamp stood polished and still. The inspector paced, eyes sharp. "No fingerprints worth keeping," he said. "And yet something feels off." Miss Marple's attention had strayed to a small iron bracket fixed below the sill. A length of frayed cord dangled from it. She bent slightly. "Was this here last night, I wonder?" Mallerie knelt to examine it. "Looks like an old tie for the window shutter," Pettigrew offered. Mallerie shook his head. "No, Black was particular. He wouldn't leave a rope hanging loose. And there's a clean break, as if someone tore it free." They descended, the inspector brooding. At the base, he paused to scan the shore where the tide lapped lazily among the stones. Something glinted between two rocks. Pettigrew scrambled down and returned with a short length of brass pipe, green with salt. Mallerie weighed it in his hand. "Heavy enough to leave a bruise," he said quietly. News of the discovery travelled through the village like fire through dry gorse. By the time Miss Marple and Caroline reached the Green Dragon Inn for luncheon, the tap-room buzzed with speculation. "The weapon, they say," muttered old Mr. Green, the landlord, polishing a glass with slow deliberation. "Thrown down from the tower, more'n likely." Mrs. Penworthy, who had installed herself at a corner table, leaned forward eagerly. "And who, I should like to know, had the opportunity to fling bits of brass about, except that surly fisherman?" "Sam wouldn't harm a gull," Lily Prout protested hotly. "He minds his own business." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "People often do harm, my dear, not because they are naturally cruel, but because they are pressed by circumstances." She let the remark hang, allowing it to settle without committing it to any one person. That afternoon, Caroline persuaded Miss Marple to walk with her along the cliff-top path beyond the harbour. The breeze was keen, carrying the scent of gorse and salt. Below them the sea churned pale green against the rocks. "Do you think Sam could truly have done it?" Caroline asked hesitantly. Miss Marple did not answer at once. She paused by a stile, gazing toward the lighthouse solitary against the sky. "I have learned, my dear, never to decide too soon, but I do wonder why Mr. Black should have been guarding the lantern room so carefully of late. People rarely lock doors unless they fear someone might open them." When they returned to the cottage, a note awaited them from Mallerie. He requested Miss Marple's presence at the reading room later in the day, explaining that he wished to discuss her impressions. Caroline raised an eyebrow. "You see, Jane, even the police know you notice things." Miss Marple only smiled and went to fetch her shawl. In the reading room, Mallerie spread out a chart of the lighthouse stairwell, dotted with neat pencil marks. "Each witness agrees on the order they stood," he said. "But there's a gap of several moments between the clang and Black's fall. If someone struck him, they had to be in the lantern room before he went over. None admits to entering." Miss Marple examined the chart. "Might there have been a way inside not visible to the others? A side door, perhaps?" Mallerie shook his head. "Only the main entrance. But Pettigrew tells me Sam Tripp often kept tools in the storage alcove just inside the threshold. If he went in to fetch something, no one would think twice." Quite so, Miss Marple said. And yet a fisherman would be unlikely to carry a brass pipe up a staircase for no reason. Her eyes twinkled faintly. Unless, of course, it was already there. The inspector leaned back, frowning. You think the pipe belonged to Black? I think, she replied gently, that Mr. Black may have discovered something he was not meant to see, and that the object used against him may tell us what. Outside, the sun was dipping westward, bathing the village in mellow gold. But even in that warmth, St. Gildas felt restless. Doors were bolted earlier than usual. Curtains twitched at the slightest sound. On the point, the lighthouse stood white and silent, its blank windows turned toward the sea. As darkness gathered, Miss Marple sat once more by Caroline's hearth, her knitting set aside in favor of quiet contemplation. The threads of the case were beginning to align. A lonely keeper guarding a secret, an intruder in the tower, a blow delivered in haste, and the hurried disposal of a weapon. Yet she sensed another strand, finer and more elusive, a motive woven deep into village life, hidden behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. She leaned back, eyes half closed, and listened to the wind prowling around the eaves. Somewhere out there the answer waited, as patient as the tide itself, biding its time until the right question would draw it to shore. The following day brought a thin, silvery rain that blurred the outline of St. Gildas against the sea. Mist clung to the cottages, softening their angles, and the lighthouse loomed like a ghost through drifting veils. Miss Marple, having risen early, found Caroline Linton already laying the breakfast table, humming in an absent-minded way. The older lady poured herself tea and glanced toward the window, where droplets chased one another down the glass. Inspector Mallerie has sent word, Caroline announced. He means to question everyone again, but separately this time. He thinks someone's story will not bear close scrutiny. Miss Marple nodded. That is generally how truth begins to show itself, my dear. Not with great revelations, but with small frays in the fabric. When the summons arrived mid-morning, Miss Marple walked to the reading room beneath a dripping umbrella. She was greeted by Pettigrew, who bustled about with ledgers and damp boots and shown to a chair near the hearth. Mallerie stood by the window, staring at the grey sweep of sea. On the table lay the brass pipe, carefully wrapped in cloth beside a small tin of polishing paste. I had the pipe examined, Mallerie said without preamble. Sea-worn, but not so corroded as I first thought. Pettigrew found traces of lamp oil near the end. Miss Marple regarded the object. How interesting. That would suggest it belonged inside the lantern room. Mallerie inclined his head, which narrows matters. Black may have kept it as a handle for adjusting the lamp mechanism. But why strike him with his own tool? Pettigrew shifted uneasily. Maybe he startled someone? Came up sudden and they, well, lashed out. Precisely, Miss Marple murmured. Fear is often swifter than malice. She turned the thought over in silence, eyes on the blurred window. May I see Mr. Black's logbook? Mallerie produced a thick volume. The final entries were spidery lines dated 2 nights before the murder. Strange light at sea, far off. Will keep watch. Locking the lamp room. Below a final scrawl. Must speak to... The name that followed was smudged beyond recognition. Caroline arrived soon after, bearing a basket of sandwiches. She settled beside Miss Marple, curiosity bright in her eyes. Mallerie frowned but allowed her to remain. Perhaps you two could help me piece this together, he said, gesturing at a chalkboard where he had written each villager's name in tidy columns. They began with Mrs. Penworthy, whose chatter, Mallerie observed, might conceal more than it revealed. She had been closest to the base of the stairs, gossiping with Lily Prout, yet claimed to have seen no one slip inside. Next came Hardwick, the retired naval man who had kept to the far wall, apparently admiring the lamp's engineering. His account was exact, almost rehearsed. Mallerie underlined his name. Lily Prout's statement wavered slightly under scrutiny. She insisted she never moved from her spot by the doorway. Yet Mallory's notes from the previous evening suggested she had edged nearer to the steps when the foghorn sounded. Pettigrew remarked that the girl looked pale when asked whether she had touched the rail. Sam Tripp's turn came last. He perched on a chair, cap clutched in both hands, staring at the floor. I didn't lay a finger on him, he said gruffly. All I did was check the hooks by the threshold. That's all? Mallerie eyed him. You're sure you didn't pick up anything? A stick, a bit of pipe? Sam bristled, colour rising in his weathered face. Why would I? Miss Marple observed him gently. "Because perhaps you thought Mr. Black meant to accuse you of something, and you wished only to defend yourself." The fisherman blinked, then looked away, lips working as though to speak. But no words came. At last he shook his head and asked to leave. When they were alone again, Mallerie sighed. "I can't get past the timing. Every one of them swears they heard the clang, and then the fall. No one admits to stepping inside the lantern room at that moment." Miss Marple studied the board. "And yet, my dear Inspector, you assume the blow and the fall occurred in that order. Suppose Mr. Black fell first, or was made to, and the clang followed as the assailant hurried away." Mallerie frowned, chewing the suggestion. "Then the weapon was thrown down after him. Perhaps it was dropped in surprise." She tapped a finger lightly against Sam Tripp's name. "I think our fisherman saw something that frightened him, something about the lamp or the view from the window." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll to the harbour. The tide lay low, revealing dark weed-slicked rocks. She stopped at the base of the lighthouse, gazing up at the white tower streaked with rain. A faint memory stirred, something about the placement of the ladder inside the door and the dust on its rungs. She made a mental note to return later, when she might look without interruption. Back at the inn, the villagers huddled round the fire, exchanging theories in low tones. Mrs. Penworthy clucked that the ghost of some long-dead sailor had returned to claim vengeance. Lily Prout kept nervously smoothing her apron, as though to erase invisible stains. Hardwick sat apart, nursing a tankard, eyes half-hooded. Caroline leaned close to Miss Marple. "You think one of them knows the truth," she whispered. "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, "but knowledge and confession are not the same." Her needles clicked steadily as she knitted, though her gaze lingered on the window where rain pattered softly against the glass. By early evening the weather cleared, revealing a pale wash of sunset over the sea. Miss Marple borrowed Caroline's lantern and returned alone to the lighthouse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp stone and oil. She examined the ladder by the entrance, noting that the upper rungs were faintly clean as though recently grasped, while the lower remained coated with fine dust. Someone had used it, but not climbed all the way up. She continued to the stairwell, pausing halfway to study the curve of the rail. The dent lay just above a point where the inner wall jutted slightly, forming a narrow ledge. If one leaned here, holding something heavy, the lantern room would be just out of sight of anyone below. She pictured the scene, black ascending, a shadow waiting, the sudden arc of brass. When she emerged, the first stars shone faintly above the village roofs. She walked back slowly, thoughts arranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. There was motive somewhere, fear perhaps, or a secret Black had discovered. And there was opportunity, a handful of people within arm's reach when the keeper met his end. Caroline greeted her with a steaming pot of tea. "Any luck?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only a few more threads, my dear. But threads have a way of forming patterns, if one takes the trouble to look closely." She set down her gloves and seated herself by the hearth, content for now to let the fire's warmth and the ticking of the clock accompany her thoughts. Night deepened outside, wrapping the village in soft darkness. In cottages and on boats, lamps winked out one by one. The lighthouse, standing aloof at the point, showed only its blank face, guarding the secret of what had happened within. But Miss Marple, knitting steadily, felt she had begun to glimpse the shape of the truth hidden beneath the fog. Morning light poured through gauzy curtains at the Rose and Crown, gilding the breakfast table with a watery glow. The storm had passed, leaving the sea calm and reflective like a sheet of polished glass. Villagers trickled in to take their porridge and tea, subdued by the lingering unease that followed the keeper's death. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner, watched faces with quiet attention while her knitting needles clicked rhythmically. Sam Tripp sat apart, shoulders hunched, staring into a mug of coffee gone cold. Lily Prout arrived late, flushed and breathless, apologizing as she slipped into a seat near Mrs. Penworthy, who was already speculating about hauntings and sea curses. Hardwick, stiff-backed and correct, read the morning paper without seeming to see the words. Even Caroline, normally cheerful, seemed weighed down, stirring her tea absently. Inspector Mallerie appeared in the doorway, brushing raindrops from his hat, though there had been no rain for hours. He crossed to Miss Marple's table and inclined his head. "Mrs. Linton tells me you were at the Lighthouse again yesterday evening," he said quietly. "Yes, Inspector." "Curiosity is rather a vice of mine," she replied, a twinkle softening the firmness of her gaze. Mallerie pulled up a chair. "Did you find anything?" Miss Marple hesitated, letting her knitting rest in her lap. "Only that the crime was clever, but not clever enough to hide human nature. Someone went up that ladder, but not all the way. They wanted to make it appear as though Mr. Black was struck in the lantern room, yet the evidence suggests a scuffle on the stairs." Mallerie frowned thoughtfully. "I've been thinking along similar lines. Pettigrew and I will examine the steps again this afternoon." After breakfast, Miss Marple strolled to the quay with Caroline, who held a small basket of bread for the gulls. The air smelled of salt and drying seaweed. Gulls wheeled and cried above the still water. Caroline, her brow furrowed, glanced at Miss Marple. "You really believe one of our neighbours did it?" "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "one must not let fondness blind one to facts. Murder is rarely the act of a stranger. More often it is born from resentment, fear, or opportunity, sometimes all three." Caroline shivered despite the mild morning. "If only Black hadn't been so secretive these last weeks. He told me once he'd noticed lights out beyond Gull's Head Rock, but he wouldn't say more. That remark may prove very important," Miss Marple mused. "Black kept records, you know. The logbook mentioned a light at sea. Perhaps he had reason to think someone used the rocks for illicit purposes." Caroline's eyes widened. "Smuggling, here? Or some modern equivalent? People will always find new ways to disguise old sins." By midday, Mallerie had summoned the villagers to the reading room of the inn. The long oak table stood at the centre, its surface strewn with papers and the brass pipe, now polished to a dull gleam. Pettigrew hovered by the fire, notebook in hand. Mallerie remained standing as the others settled uneasily into chairs. "I want to go over everyone's movements again," Mallerie announced. "And this time we'll take it step by step." He called first upon Mrs. Penworthy, whose insistence that she had remained near the base of the stairs grew more shrill the longer she spoke. Lily Prout, pale and nervous, admitted she had leaned toward the steps when the foghorn blew, just to see if Black needed help, but swore she never set foot on them. Hardwick maintained his calm account, though Mallerie pressed him about a moment when he might have slipped from view. Sam Tripp, summoned last, approached the table reluctantly. His hands trembled as he removed his cap. "I said before I didn't touch Black," he muttered. "I was minding my own business." Mallory's gaze hardened. "You were nearest the door, weren't you? If Black came down to speak with you, there'd have been no witnesses." Sam flushed scarlet. "You're barking up the wrong tree. I wouldn't harm him." Miss Marple's voice, gentle but firm, broke the tension. "No one is accusing you, Mr. Tripp, but I think you know something you haven't shared. Perhaps you saw a signal on the water, or maybe Mr. Black caught sight of someone rowing where they shouldn't have been." Sam blinked, eyes darting toward the window where the sea lay calm and deceptively innocent. For an instant, guilt flickered in his expression before he masked it with stubborn silence. Mallerie dismissed them one by one, leaving only Miss Marple by the hearth. "You've put him on edge," he said, lowering his voice. "Do you think Tripp's our man?" Miss Marple shook her head. "He may have secrets, but I don't sense murder in him. He's frightened, not of being accused, but of what might come to light if he speaks." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple wandered to the lighthouse alone, carrying a basket that ostensibly held a pot of jam for Pettigrew. The keeper's room at the base was quiet, dust motes dancing in pale light. She studied the stairs, tracing the groove in the rail where the weapon had struck. Her eyes lingered on a faint smudge near the wall, a print perhaps, or the mark of a sleeve brushing stone. She climbed slowly, pausing to glance out of a narrow slit window. The view took in the rocks offshore, where pale foam curled and broke. She imagined a small boat anchored there on the night of the murder, a clandestine meeting observed from above. Black, devoted to duty, might have tried to intervene. Miss Marple descended thoughtfully, her plan forming. She would draw the guilty person into betraying themselves, but delicately so as not to spook them. The trick, as always, lay in appearing harmless. That evening she joined Caroline, Mrs. Penworthy, Lily Prout and Hardwick in the lounge. A cheerful fire crackled, throwing golden light on their faces. The conversation, though meant to be light, returned again to the murder. Mrs. Penworthy fretted about ghosts while Lily sat taut and silent, hands twisting in her lap. Hardwick polished his spectacles, gaze unreadable. Miss Marple cleared her throat, her tone conversational. "I happened to notice something peculiar today," she said. "The steps in the lighthouse, the dust on them to be precise. Only one set of prints disturbed the lower rungs of the ladder. Above that the dust lay untouched," Mrs. Penworthy gasped. "Why then Black must have gone higher alone." "Or," Miss Marple continued mildly, "someone climbed part way, waited for him and struck when he passed." Lily let out a sharp breath, drawing all eyes. She forced a smile, colour draining from her cheeks. "Well, whoever it was, they've more courage than I'd stomach," she said with a nervous laugh. Miss Marple bent over her knitting, hiding a flicker of interest in her eyes. Courage, perhaps, or desperation. She let the remark settle before changing the subject to recipes for quince jelly. Later, as the inn grew quiet, she retired to her room and wrote a few notes by the glow of a lamp. One name she underlined twice, Hardwick. Another, Lily, she circled. But her thoughts returned most often to the untidy scrawl in Black's logbook and the faintly clean rungs of the ladder. There was a pattern, she felt sure, one she must tease out gently, like easing a knot from tangled yarn. Outside, the moon cast silver on the sea, illuminating the dark silhouette of the lighthouse. Somewhere among her fellow guests, someone lay awake, fearing the trap Miss Marple had begun to set. Dawn broke clear and sharp, washing St. Gilda's in a pale amber light. The tide had crept far out overnight, leaving ribs of rock exposed like the bones of some great creature. Miss Marple, rising earlier than usual, watched from her window as a figure crossed the shingle path toward the quay. The shape, compact and brisk, resolved into Hardwick. He paused at the edge of the harbour, scanning the horizon before walking off toward the cliffs. Miss Marple tucked the observation away, as carefully as a pressed flower between pages. Downstairs, the inn was stirring. Caroline prepared trays of toast, her movements quick but distracted. Mrs. Penworthy's voice floated from the parlour, thick with excitement. She claimed to have dreamt of the murdered keeper, who urged her to mind the lamp. Lily Prout hovered by the door, her face pale against the dark scarf tied under her chin. Sam Tripp had not yet appeared. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and sat quietly, content to let the others chatter. She asked Caroline in an apparently offhand way whether Hardwick often walked alone so early. Caroline shook her head. "Not that I know of. He's a man of routine, likes his breakfast before any ramble." Her tone carried faint surprise. Mallerie entered, bringing a brisk draught of air with him. He greeted the room, then crossed to Miss Marple. "I've arranged to search the keeper's quarters this morning," he murmured. "Would you care to accompany me?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I should be delighted, Inspector, if you don't think I'll be underfoot." The lighthouse interior seemed gloomier in daylight, the sun catching on dust in the air. Pettigrew, already there with a satchel of tools, was prizing open a narrow cupboard near the base. Inside lay oil rags, a battered flask, and a small wooden box secured with a clasp. Mallerie clicked it open. Within were scraps of paper, notes in Black's cramped hand. One read, "Signal again near Gull's Head Rock. Must speak with H. Mallerie." Frowned. "Ah," he repeated. "Hardwick?" "Possibly," Miss Marple replied, "or someone else with that initial. But one wonders why Black would arrange to meet anyone at so remote a spot." While Pettigrew examined the papers, Miss Marple climbed partway up the stairs. She stopped at the landing where the rail dent caught the light. Bending, she traced a faint smear darkened by oil, as though a sleeve brushed it recently. She peered upward to the ladder leading into the lantern room. No marks disturbed the dust there. The killer had indeed waited lower down. Back at the inn for luncheon, Mallerie gathered the guests in the lounge. He recited the new evidence, noting Black's mysterious reference to H. Mrs. Penworthy tutted about sinister initials, while Lily sat stiff, fingers locked together. Hardwick's face betrayed nothing, though his jaw was set more tightly than usual. Miss Marple observed quietly, her knitting resting in her lap. When conversation lulled, she spoke, as though considering an unrelated matter. "It is curious," she said, "how some people rise before dawn, while others prefer a comfortable lie-in. One learns so much about character from such habits." Hardwick looked up sharply, then covered the reaction with a cough. Miss Marple caught the flicker and returned serenely to her wool. That afternoon she took a walk along the path above the harbour, ostensibly to admire the view. The air smelled of brine and sun-warmed heather. From her vantage she could see Gull's Head Rock, dark against the glittering water. A narrow trail, half hidden by gorse, led down to a small cove where a boat might be drawn up unseen. A recent tide had left damp sand, crisscrossed with footprints too blurred to read. She stood there for several minutes, letting the wind whip at her hat, until footsteps sounded behind her. Hardwick approached, hat in hand, pretending surprise. "Mrs. Marple," he said, a shade too hearty. "Enjoying the scenery?" "Indeed," she replied pleasantly. "Such a lonely spot. One imagines it could conceal many a secret." His smile thinned. "You don't mean—" "About poor Black?" Miss Marple regarded the sea. "Only that lighthouses attract more than storms. Warnings, signals, perhaps meetings meant to be unseen." Hardwick gave a short laugh, but it lacked warmth. "Far-fetched notions, if you ask me." He tipped his hat and strode off toward the village. Miss Marple watched him go, her face unreadable. She remained until he vanished from view, then turned back along the path, her mind alive with possibilities. That evening the common room filled early. Mallerie played a quiet game of draughts with Pettigrew, while Caroline served a simple supper of soup and bread. Mrs. Penworthy held forth about spectral lights on stormy nights. Lily, tense and silent, barely touched her plate. Sam Tripp finally arrived, smelling faintly of tar and seaweed, muttering an apology for his lateness. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, let her needles rest as she addressed the group. "I've been thinking," she began mildly, "how accidents often happen where tempers run high. But in this case it seems the keeper was struck from behind. No quarrel, no warning." Sam shifted uneasily. Hardwick sat very still, eyes on his soup. Lily glanced between them, colour draining from her cheeks. Mallerie leaned back, arms folded. "Do you suggest premeditation, Mrs. Marple?" "Not necessarily," she said. "But whoever held that pipe was near panic, not cold-blooded so much as desperate." She let her words drift into the silence. Caroline, sensing tension, hurried to speak of lighter matters. Yet the mood did not lift. Sam excused himself early. Lily followed soon after, murmuring something about a headache. Hardwick remained, staring into the fire as though weighing private concerns. Later, in her room, Miss Marple arranged her notes once more. On a scrap of paper she listed the names: Hardwick, Lily, Sam. Beside Hardwick she wrote H, logbook, dawn walk, signal. Beside Lily a question mark and the phrase startled at ladder prints. Sam's name carried a line beneath: fear, not guilt. She paused, pen in hand, thinking of the path to the cove and Hardwick's stiff composure. He was a man accustomed to control, yet secrecy had threaded through his movements like dark silk. Still, motive was not yet clear, and Lily's nerves suggested knowledge of something dangerous. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Tomorrow, she decided, she would set her small snare. An innocent-sounding remark, a suggestion of new evidence. The guilty party would not be able to resist betraying themselves. The moon rode high when she finally extinguished her lamp. Downstairs the inn had grown silent. Only the sea's sighing broke the hush. Across the village, the lighthouse rose against the stars, a mute and implacable, as if waiting for the truth to be spoken aloud. Sunlight slanted across St. Gilda's the next morning, spilling over the harbour and catching on the whitewashed walls of the cottages. The village appeared tranquil, yet a quiet unease hung over its people, like a thin mist refusing to lift. Miss Marple descended the narrow stairs of the Rose and Crown, her knitting bag tucked neatly under one arm, and found Caroline arranging a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast. "You slept well, I hope?" Caroline asked, though her voice lacked its usual brightness. "Well enough," Miss Marple replied, "but I fear poor Mr. Black will not let me rest until I understand why he died." At the far table, Sam Tripp nursed a cup of tea, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Hardwick sat upright, his paper folded precisely, every gesture tidy and deliberate. Lily Prout arrived a moment later, avoiding everyone's gaze as she slipped into a seat by the window. Mrs. Penworthy bustled in with her usual chatter, though her words were edged with nervous energy. Inspector Mallerie entered soon after, carrying a brown envelope. He nodded a polite greeting and joined Miss Marple by the hearth. "More from Black's quarters," he said quietly, opening the envelope to reveal a single torn page. We found this wedged behind a chest. Looks like a continuation of the last entry in his logbook. Miss Marple examined the page. The handwriting, spidery but firm, read, "Spoke with H tonight. Warned him to stop. He insists the run must go on. If the tide holds, they'll try again after moonset." She handed the paper back thoughtfully. "That seems to confirm our surmise, Inspector. Mr. Black stumbled upon something, who and someone, of a most irregular nature." Mallory's jaw tightened. "Hardwick," he muttered. "Who else fits the bill?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Names can deceive. We mustn't leap to conclusions until the person's behavior supports it." After breakfast, she wandered toward the quay, where the tide lapped gently against worn timbers. A few fishing boats bobbed lazily, their sails furled. Sam Tripp was mending nets nearby, glancing up nervously as she approached. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Good morning, Mr. Tripp." She watched him work for a moment before speaking again. "Tell me, did Mr. Black ever speak to you about the lights near Gull's Head Rock?" Sam hesitated, then gave a small shake of his head. "Not straight, he didn't, but I reckon he guessed things. Things weren't on the up and up." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Secrets weigh heavy, don't they? I dare say Mr. Black intended to do the right thing, but that can be dangerous when others stand to lose." She let the remark settle, then changed the subject to fishing seasons, leaving him with a faintly troubled expression. By midday, Mallerie convened everyone once again in the lounge. Pettigrew stood by the mantelpiece ready with his notebook. The guests gathered reluctantly, their unease palpable. Mallerie outlined the new discovery from the logbook, emphasizing the reference to H. Mrs. Penworthy gasped theatrically. "Then it's that dreadful letter again. H for Hardwick, I've said it from the start." Hardwick's expression barely shifted, though a faint tick stirred at the corner of his jaw. "Speculation helps no one," he said crisply. "If Black suspected me, he was mistaken." Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, spoke in a tone of mild curiosity. "I wonder," she said, "whether Mr. Black meant to meet someone that very night. Someone who promised to explain the lights offshore. Perhaps the signal was visible even from the stairs where he fell." Lily flinched, a tiny movement that drew Miss Marple's eye. Hardwick glanced at her, quick and sharp, before returning his gaze to the fire. Sam shifted in his seat, knuckles whitening on his cap. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch before resuming her work. "'Tis a pity," she remarked airily, "that Mr. Black left no description of the person he confronted. I've half a mind to return to the lighthouse tonight, when the tide is low. The moon will be bright, one might see quite clearly from the stair landing." Her words, though lightly spoken, fell with deliberate weight. Lily's teacup rattled as she set it down too quickly. Hardwick's eyes flickered toward Mallerie, then back to the fire, the muscles in his neck taut. Sam muttered something under his breath and stared fixedly at the floor. Caroline, sensing the rising tension, tried to steer the conversation toward the spring fete, but the mood remained strained. Pettigrew busied himself with papers, though he shot Miss Marple an admiring look, recognizing the bait she had laid. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked with Caroline to the headland path. The air was crisp, scented with heather and salt. They paused to watch waves breaking over Gull's Head Rock, their white spray catching the sun. Caroline frowned. "You meant to provoke someone back there," she said quietly. Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Only to see whose conscience might stir. Guilt, my dear, is a restless thing. It resents being left in peace." From their vantage, they saw Hardwick heading down toward the cove again, striding with military purpose. A small figure, Lily, trailed at a distance, pausing often as though undecided. Miss Marple watched, noting every movement. As dusk fell, she returned to the inn and arranged for Mallerie to meet her later by the lighthouse. She did not explain the details, only that she expected a significant development. Mallerie raised an eyebrow but agreed. Evening settled softly, the sea reflecting a lavender sky. Miss Marple, wrapped in a warm shawl, sat knitting by the fire while guests came and went. Lily hovered near the window, pale and restless. Hardwick remained composed, though his eyes flicked occasionally toward the door. Sam Tripp drank silently, shoulders hunched. When the clock struck 9, Miss Marple rose, feigning a yawn. "I think I shall walk a little before bed," she announced, gathering her shawl. Her manner was placid, but inside she felt the quiet tension of a line drawn taut, waiting for the fish to bite. The path to the lighthouse was silvered by moonlight, the tide whispering softly below. She paused midway up the stairs, listening. Somewhere above, a faint creak disturbed the stillness. She waited, hands folded calmly, then began to ascend, her soft steps barely stirring the air. At the landing, where the dented rail gleamed faintly, she paused again. The lantern above threw a pale shimmer through its panes. A shadow moved beyond the glass, hesitant then steady. Miss Marple's lips curved ever so slightly. Someone had taken the bait. She turned, descending carefully toward the entrance where Mallerie, concealed by darkness, waited as arranged. "Patience, Inspector," she whispered. "We are very close now." Beyond them, the lighthouse stood tall and silent, its beam sweeping slowly across the water. The calm night masked the quickened heartbeats of those who feared what the next hour might reveal. The sea lay calm beneath a cold moon, its surface broken only by the steady sweep of the lighthouse beam. Miss Marple stood in the shadow of the outer wall, her shawl drawn tight against the night air. Beside her, Inspector Mallerie waited, hands buried in the pockets of his coat. From their vantage point, they could see the narrow stair curling inside the tower, lit faintly by a lamp near the keeper's room. "Are you certain someone will come?" Mallerie whispered. "Quite," Miss Marple replied softly. "Her guilty conscience is far more punctual than innocence." They waited in silence, the only sound the hush of the tide against the rocks. Then faint footsteps creaked on the upper landing. A pause followed, the hesitant shifting of weight, a breath caught and held. The figure of Lily Prout appeared, framed for an instant against the lamplight. She moved cautiously, glancing behind her, then continued upward. Mallerie tensed. "Shall I stop her?" "Not yet," Miss Marple murmured. "She is frightened, but not of us." Moments later, another figure emerged at the foot of the tower, taller, broader, his outline unmistakable even in shadow. Hardwick moved with deliberate care, pausing once to look seaward before beginning the climb. His boots rang dully against the iron steps. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. "You see, Inspector? The fox follows the rabbit." Inside, Lily had reached the landing where the dented rail gleamed faintly. She bent, searching the floor as if for something dropped. A sharp whisper echoed from below. "Miss Prout," Hardwick hissed, his voice low but urgent. "What are you doing here?" She spun around, backing against the wall. I needed to see. I couldn't keep quiet." Hardwick mounted the last few steps, his face a mask of stern control. "You fool. Do you want everything ruined?" "I didn't mean—" Lily faltered, wringing her hands. "I only wanted to make sure Mr. Black hadn't left more papers." "Black is beyond troubling us now," Hardwick said grimly. "But you'll join him if you persist." Mallerie made a move, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. "Let them speak," she whispered. Confessions rarely bloom under interruption. Lily's shoulders trembled. "I never wanted anyone hurt," she whispered. "I thought it was just messages. Harmless. Until that night, Hardwick closed the space between them. It was always more than messages. You knew enough to stay silent." "No," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Mr. Black guessed, and you pushed him." His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Careful what you say." "You did," Lily insisted, tears gleaming in the lamplight. "You came up behind him on the stairs. I saw you. I didn't mean to, but I was there." "I heard you threaten him." Hardwick reached for her arm. "You were never meant to see." "That changes things." Miss Marple chose that moment to step into the stairwell, her voice mild yet commanding. "Colonel Hardwick, I should advise you to leave Miss Prout be. Inspector Mallerie is just outside." Hardwick froze, his hand still half extended. Mallerie entered swiftly, revolver drawn, his face set. "Stand aside, Colonel." For a heartbeat, Hardwick considered resistance. Then he exhaled and let his hand drop. "So," he said evenly, "the old lady wins the day." Miss Marple descended a step, her knitting bag swinging gently from her wrist. "It was not a matter of victory, Colonel, but of truth. Mr. Black was an honest man. He discovered that you were using the lighthouse to signal smugglers along the coast. A neat arrangement, though rather illegal." Hardwick gave a dry laugh. "Smuggling brandy hardly seems worth murder." "Brandy, perhaps not," Miss Marple said. "But these were no mere casks. Contraband radios, foreign currency, perhaps information sent to less friendly shores. You needed the beam for your timings, and Mr. Black threatened to report you." Lily buried her face in her hands. "I begged him not to," she sobbed. "I didn't think you'd—" "I had no choice," Hardwick cut in sharply. though his calm was fraying. The fool was halfway to Mallerie already. A push and nothing more. I thought the fall would look accidental, except that you misjudged the height, Miss Marple observed gently. The broken rail suggested a scuffle, and Mr. Black's notes confirmed he'd found a dangerous secret. Mallerie snapped handcuffs over Hardwick's wrists. You'll answer for this, Colonel. The older man stood tall despite the irons, his profile rigid against the lamplight. I suppose I will, he said quietly. I served my country once. Strange to end this way. Miss Marple regarded him gravely. It is always sad when honor turns to expedience. Lily clung to the banister, shaking. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. You were drawn in by charm and a promise of adventure, my dear. But such promises are rarely kept without cost. Mallerie escorted Hardwick down the stairs, leaving Miss Marple with Lily. Together they followed, emerging into the chill night where Pettigrew waited by the path, eyes wide at the sight of his employer in irons. The inspector led his prisoner toward the inn, while Miss Marple paused by the sea wall. The moon cast a silver road across the water, serene and indifferent to human folly. She stood quietly, her thoughts wandering to all the tragedies born of greed and fear, of pride and foolish secrecy. Lily stood beside her, calmer now but still pale. Will they be very hard on him? She asked softly. That will be for the court to decide, Miss Marple replied. But remember, child, concealment is often the beginning of disaster. One little deception, and soon you're standing on a staircase with a man's life in your hands. The girl nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Miss Marple offered her arm, guiding her gently along the path. Behind them the lighthouse shone steadily, its light sweeping over dark water, no longer a signal for crime, but a quiet sentinel over a village that had nearly lost its peace. At the inn, guests gathered anxiously in the parlor awaiting news. When Mallerie entered with Hardwick, a collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Penworthy clutched her pearls. Sam Tripp stared, guilt and relief warring on his face. Mallerie addressed them briskly. Colonel Hardwick is under arrest for the murder of Benjamin Black and for participating in illicit trafficking along this coast. Hardwick met their stares with cool composure, though a muscle ticked at his jaw. Save your shock, he said dryly. You were all too willing to believe the worst of each other. Miss Marple took a chair by the hearth, hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not gloat or scold. Her gaze rested instead on the faces before her, the frightened maid, the chastened fisherman, the bustling widow now subdued. All had been touched in some way by the darkness hiding beneath their quiet village. Tea, I think, she said at last, her tone as mild as ever. There's very little in life, Inspector. That isn't made more bearable by tea. Pettigrew hurried to oblige, and as cups were passed, the storm that had gathered over St. Gilda's seemed, at last, to break and drift away, leaving only the lighthouse beam and the calm of the night. Dawn broke over St. Gilda's with a faint blush of rose and gold, brushing the sea into soft ripples that licked at the pebbled shore. The village, after its restless night, seemed almost shy in the gentle light, as if uncertain how to return to its former serenity. At the Rose and Crown, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the briny air drifting in through open windows. Miss Marple sat at a small table near the hearth, her knitting neatly folded beside her cup of tea. She had risen early, as was her habit, and watched the inn slowly wake. Pettigrew sweeping the threshold, Caroline clinking crockery as she prepared the morning trays, and Sam Tripp slipping in from the yard, his cap in his hands, eyes downcast. The previous evening's events hung like a shadow in everyone's thoughts. Colonel Hardwick was locked in the magistrate's cell, guarded by 2 constables summoned from the next town. Lily Prout had cried herself to sleep in a spare room upstairs, watched over by Caroline, who treated her with a quiet, protective kindness. Inspector Mallerie arrived just after 7, looking tired but satisfied. He placed a thin file on the table and accepted the tea Pettigrew poured. He's confessed fully, Mallerie said, his voice steady but heavy. He admitted to everything, the smuggling, the threats, the push on the staircase. Claimed it was an accident, of course, but he shook his head. That man has been hiding behind respectability for years. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the corners of her mouth softening into a faint, thoughtful smile. One finds, Inspector, that respectability is often an excellent disguise, but rarely a sturdy one. Caroline brought a plate of warm scones and lingered, her face anxious. "Will Lily be charged?" Mallerie shook his head. "No, she'll testify, but she wasn't part of the planning. Just dazzled by his stories, poor child. We'll see she gets home safely." At the mention of her name, Lily descended the staircase slowly, pale but composed. She glanced hesitantly toward Miss Marple, then took a seat at her side. "I'm so ashamed," she murmured. "If I'd spoken sooner, Mr. Black might be alive." Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand. "Mr. Black's death lies only with the man who pushed him, my dear. Yet it is wise to remember how small secrets can grow, and how loyalty to the wrong person can lead one down treacherous paths." Lily nodded, eyes glistening. Sam Tripp shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "I didn't mean to stir things up, miss," he said quietly. "When I told you about seeing Hardwick near the Lighthouse that night, I wasn't sure I'd done right." "You did exactly right," Miss Marple said kindly. "Telling the truth is seldom comfortable, but it is always necessary." A hush settled over the room, broken only by the clatter of Pettigrew arranging the sideboard. Outside, gulls wheeled and cried above the harbour. Life, persistent as the tide, was moving on. Later that morning, Miss Marple accompanied Mallerie and Pettigrew to the lighthouse for a final look. The tower rose stark and white against a sky of soft blue, its lamp still revolving, casting a slow, reassuring sweep across the calm waters. Inside, the stairs spiraled upward in neat stone, their iron rail newly polished, where the struggle had left its mark. Mallerie paused near the landing. Strange to think how a man's life can end over such a trifle, a shove born of fear. Not a trifle to him, Miss Marple observed, nor to Mr. Black. He stood for duty, and that is rarely convenient to those who would rather hide. She stooped to examine a scuff on the floorboards, then straightened with a small sigh. "Places remember, Inspector, even when people try to forget." They stepped outside again, and Miss Marple lingered, gazing over the headland where heather stirred in a salt breeze. The lighthouse beam swung slowly over the sea, no longer a conspirator's tool, but a sentinel restored to purpose. By afternoon, word had spread that the case was solved. Villagers gathered at their doors, speaking in low tones as the constables escorted Hardwick to a waiting car. Mrs. Penworthy, determined to provide an air of propriety, wore her best hat and nodded gravely as he passed, though later she could be heard recounting every detail to anyone who would listen. Lily stood apart, twisting her gloves nervously. Miss Marple approached her with a gentle smile. "You will recover, child," she said softly. "But you must choose wiser company in future. There is no shame in having been misled, only in refusing to learn from it." Caroline joined them, slipping an arm around Lily's shoulders. "She'll stay with me for a while," Caroline said firmly. "St. Gilda's isn't always kind to those who stumble." Miss Marple looked approvingly at her hostess. "A little kindness is often the best safeguard against regret," she said. That evening, the inn's parlour was once more a place of quiet conversation. Lamps glowed warmly on polished tables, and the kettle hissed cheerfully on the hob. Mallerie had returned to the station, and Pettigrew entertained Sam and Mrs. Penworthy with a subdued account of the arrest, carefully omitting anything sensational. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked a row of pale blue yarn. The sea lay dark beyond the panes, its steady rhythm soothing after the turmoil of recent days. Caroline joined her, setting down a tray with 2 cups of tea and a plate of shortbread. "Do you ever tire of solving people's troubles?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled, a faint glint of humour in her eyes. "Oh, I wouldn't say I solve them, my dear. I merely notice what others overlook, and sometimes that leads to a little justice. And peace," Caroline added. "Peace." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, gazing out at the lighthouse beam sweeping its patient circle. "But not for everyone. Some souls never quite escape their own misdeeds." She gave a small reflective sigh. "Still, there is comfort in knowing that at least here, the truth has been set gently in its place." The clock on the mantel chimed 9. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, moving with the unhurried grace of someone at ease with the world's imperfections. She bade Caroline good night and climbed the stairs to her room, pausing once to glance through the window at the lighthouse standing sentinel against the dark. Its light gleamed steadily, free now of clandestine purposes, a reminder that even the most peaceful corners of England could harbour danger, and that watchfulness, however quiet, was the surest guard against it. As she settled beneath the quilt, Miss Marple reflected that human nature was much the same everywhere: vanity and greed, cowardice and courage, kindness and betrayal, all playing out in village lanes as easily as in London drawing rooms. But she also thought of the resilience of those who chose decency, who, like Mr. Black, faced wrongdoing and paid a price for honor. Sleep came softly, and the little inn, its guests, and the patient lighthouse beyond, sank into a calm that promised, at least for now, a return to ordinary days.